On behalf of the OOIDA Foundation, we would like to welcome you to this session of OOIDA's Business Education Series of online training. This series is the most comprehensive series of business education that has been designed exclusively for the professional truck driver. There are a lot of drivers who are really good at driving a truck, but struggle to make a living in the industry. With these presentations, we're trying to help the drivers who excel at operating a truck understand how to be a successful business person. This education series is intended to help drivers navigate the business side of the trucking industry by providing an accessible and relevant introduction to the management principles of operating a successful trucking business. We would also like to congratulate the thousands of attendees who have taken part in this series. Your overwhelming response has helped to ensure that these programs will continue into the future. Thank you for joining me for this program. Today's program is part one of a two-part series on lease agreements. More specifically, we're going to be looking at the Federal Motor Carrier Regulation 376.12, which deals with the written lease requirements. My name's Tom Gann, and I'll be your host for this program. And today I'm going to be joined by two guests, Hough and Tom Weakley, both from OOIDA. These guys both have years of experience dealing with lease agreements, and I'm sure you're going to find that their views are both knowledgeable and insightful. But before we get started, let me remind you that if you've got any questions or comments, you can simply email them to businesseducation@ooida.com, and someone from our staff will get back with you just as soon as possible. Okay, now that we've got all this intro stuff out of the way, let's get on with this program. Kip, I know that 376.12 of the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Regulations deals specifically with written lease requirements. And since that's right in the reg book, aren't all these leases basically the same thing? And do I really need to understand all the ins and outs of what's in this regulation?
Well, this is the contract between a business and another business. And yes, there are leasing regulations, and them are found in the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Regulations 376.12 is what is required in the contract itself.
Well, is there ever anything in there that's not required?
Oh, absolutely. There's no unlimited amount of stuff what can be
There's all kinds of things, aren't there?
Absolutely.
And that's what today's program is really about. People need to understand what's required and what all those add-ins are. And sometimes you have to put up with some things that maybe you don't want to.
Before we actually start on that, it's a good idea to get a copy of that lease up front. If you can, when you're thinking about leasing on to a carrier and you're looking at maybe several carriers that you've kind of whittled it down to this 3 or 4 that you're interested in, if they won't give you an advance copy of that lease that they want you to sign, that's kind of a red flag. That would make me stop and think if there's something that I should be looking for in that lease that maybe isn't the way it should be, or it could have a bad effect on my bottom line.
Okay, we're going to talk about the things that we need to be looking for in more detail later on. But let's talk about what should we be looking for that really should be in that lease?
Well, we have to look at 376.12, the leasing regulations, and we can break them out section by section here.
Okay, that's a good idea. Let's start with that first section. My understanding is that first section of the regulations kind of talks about who's who and defines some of the terminology, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It tries to define who is who. The lease regulations require leaseor and leasee. The leaseor is the truck owner, and the leaser is the motor carrier. But those terms are not always in the contract. They use carrier, owner-operator, company. The contract should define who is who in this contract. There's some key points that goes along with that. Is the motor carrier that you are leasing to, is that the signs on the outside of the door you're putting on? Is that what's on your contract? Or are you somehow subleasing through a company to a motor carrier? So you want to make sure the contract you have is with the company you are putting the signs on the door.
The next part B of 376.12, deals with the duration of the contract, doesn't it?
The duration must be specified. Most contracts, it'll say extended, it will say renewed. automatically renewed, so they do go on, for a long period of time, but it does have to specify. Most of them are a year and automatically renew thereafter. What you really want to pay attention in this is the terms of terminating. Do you have to give them a 30-day notice? Do they have to give you a 30-day notice? What is the termination clauses? Do you have to work there so long or have to repay something? I've seen one that says they've offered you training through this, so if you quit before a year's up, you owe us some money back for the training. There are
Kind of like hiring bonuses.
Yeah, exactly. There's some of them that are associated with termination fees. If you don't stay there a year, then you have to pay something back to them, or there's a termination fee for them processing paperwork or whatever. But those are the ones you really need to pay attention to, is how do you cut ties with this motor carrier once you're done with them.
And that's a very common problem that we hear at OOIDA a lot is, can they do this? I didn't like this carrier, and they promised me a $500 bonus or a $1,000 sign-on bonus. But then after I left them after a month, because I wasn't making any money, they took my whole last settlement check and said I still owed them money because I didn't live up to my contract. And so that's one of those things you want to be careful about. Sign-up bonuses and a lot of those other promises that are made to you usually have some kind of catch in them, but it must be in the lease. So if it's in there, that's where you want to look. It says, this contract is for a year, but if you don't fulfill that year contract, there's certain things that, they can come back to you on.
Part C of this regulation deals with exclusive possession and responsibility. What in the heck does that mean?
A lot of guys who have not been leased on to a carrier before, they assume that they, as an individual, are leasing on to a carrier, but that's really not the case.
You are granting to the motor carrier the exclusive possession and control of your equipment. When you're leasing to them, they have that control under the leasing regulations, but they also assume complete responsibility for the operation of that equipment also. So what that means is when you lease that truck to them, with or without a driver, they are taking control of that vehicle. That doesn't mean they get the title, that kind of stuff. It's just they control it while that lease exists. One thing that it kind of comes into play is, well, the dispatcher or the recruiter said I would get 10,000 miles a month and they're not giving it to me. Well, nothing in this contract, not a contract I've seen, ever guarantees a certain amount of freight. They control what gets dispatched.
A certain amount of miles.
Miles, exactly. But they control what gets dispatched and what doesn't. So they are holding the control here. But that's what this part does. It doesn't change the employee independent contractor relationship, but what it does is you are leasing the equipment to that motor carrier for the purpose of them moving freight.
And that carrier has exclusive use of that equipment. So if you decide...
Now, wait a minute. You're saying exclusive use. That means that they could actually put somebody else in my truck?
I see a lot of times in a contract, if you have freight on board your truck or your trailer and you're loaded and you the driver are unable to fulfill that load, they can put someone in that truck and fulfill the contract with the bill of lading, getting it there. Also in this provision or this section, it gives that the motor carrier can even lease you on to another motor carrier. Sublease to another motor carrier, or it'll also allow you as the company to lease on to another motor carrier and haul freight if they do not particularly have it. That didn't happen very often.
So those would be good things, at least for me.
It can. Insurance nightmare, but it can happen.
Even if he couldn't find me freight, maybe he could find somebody else that has some I could haul.
Or you could find someone on your own if they allow you to do that.
And is that standard in a contract?
No, very seldom.
All right, we've talked about who's the parties in the lease. We've talked about the duration of the lease. We've talked about the equipment. Let's talk about the pay. Kip?
Well, Section D requires that compensation must be specified in the contract. And believe it or not, I have read many contracts that have no compensation in it whatsoever. So they say, well, I don't think I'm getting paid right. Well, my answer is what your contract says. And they go, so it don't say anything about that. That's kind of hard to deal with. So Section D requires that compensation be specified. That's about it. It doesn't say what kind of compensation must be specified, how you're supposed to be paid, those kind of things. That's what the contract says. So what is compensation? Is it per mile, percentage, flat rate, hourly rate, whatever? You want to make sure that what you are going to do, you get compensated for. That's everything that you do. So it must have some kind of compensation clause in there, how you're getting paid. But your pay cannot change unless they change the contract with an addendum. You both have to sign it. But you also want to make sure it includes additional charges or additional pay. Accessorial charges is what we call it. This would be fuel surcharge, lumping reimbursement, tarping, detention time. That's a big one. We spend way too much time waiting uncompensated at docks, and that should be in the contract. But with the fuel the way it is right now, that's probably one of our number one calls is, am I supposed to get fuel surcharge from the motor carrier? And our answer is, what does your contract say? If it doesn't, then it's hard to deal with because your contract is what you and them agreed on.
So it should also have something in there about deadhead miles?
Anything like that, usually on percentage. If you're on a percentage of the gross, there's no gross while you're deadheading. Usually, so, but if you're paid on mileage, absolutely you have to be, know if you're getting paid for deadhead mileage, those kind of things. If you're
so
paid
it wouldn't be uncommon to get a certain cents per mile while I'm under load, but maybe a lesser percent per mile while I'm deadheading?
It's up to the contract. I've seen them all over the place.
Now, Kip, I know some contracts stipulate that I'm going to be paid by the mile. Some of them stipulate that I'm going to be paid a percentage. Which is best?
If you're paid on a percentage, first you have to know a percentage of what? Percentage of 100% of the gross. I see adjusted gross revenue. Well, I have to know what the definition is of adjusted gross revenue to go, and a lot of times the contracts don't say that. So you have to make sure that you're reading this contract and finding out that it says you get 100% or 70% of what. With the mileage pay, you have to know how or what program the carrier's using for mileage. Are they using shortest? Are they using practical? There's a big difference in those.
Could be pro miles, could be.
There's gobs of little different programs out there. And it's kind of amazing that, we can figure out exactly how close the nearest star is, but we don't know exactly how far Houston is from Chicago. You go through different programs, they're going to show you different mileage. So actual miles that you run is going to be off from what you get paid.
You would prefer to have that contract say actual miles.
Yeah, you don't see that very often, but actual miles would be
just
great.
To explain, let's just say that I'm going to run from Kansas City to Chicago, and maybe the road's out part of the way, and I have to take a detour. Well, if they're paying me listed miles or whatever, I'm just going to get paid what it normally take. I don't get paid for those extra miles I had to drive.
Well, think about it. Some of these programs go off zip code. I mean, think of how big a zip code could be. You could be at the far end of one and having to go to the far end of another and lose out on, several miles there and not get compensated for it. So, but the bottom line is, you should know how much you're making for this trip. You're the driver. You know how far it actually is. Are you making enough to make money at it? That's the bottom line.
So this is one of the things that it's going to be listed in the contract, and you need to make sure you understand it and make sure you can live with it.
You want to make sure it's in the contract first, and then really understand really what it means.
Okay, the next section in the regulations is one that's really confusing to me. It's just called items.
There's a whole bunch of stuff in this one. We're going to break it down here. First, the lease will specify who's responsible for removing identification devices. That's the stickers and the decals on the outside of the door. Most contracts require that the owner-operator take them off and get them back. The main reason for that is that the motor carrier, if you break contract and cease operation with them, they don't want you still having their signs on the outside of the door. That's why that provision's in there. But there's other requirements, and they specify specific things that have to be in here of who is responsible for, which party is responsible for fuel taxes, empty mileages, permits of all types, tolls, ferries, detention time and accessorial services, which we talked about earlier, base plates and licenses, and any unused portions of those. For example, is the base plate. If you buy the base plate through the motor carrier, it's their base plate, you're just reimbursing them for it. But if you turn that plate in, how is the unused portion? The fuel taxes, how is the unused portion of the fuel taxes, the credit, those kind of things. The contract should go in and specify those. In the regulations is who's responsible for loading and unloading property onto and from a motor vehicle, and compensation, if any. So you want to make sure you're compensated. This is work you're having to do. If it says you're required to unload the truck, or are they going to pay for lumpers to unload it for you, whatever. But this needs to be specified in there so you know who's responsible for what things on here.
So if you pull into a dock and that dock won't allow you to unload the freight, you have to use lumpers. Chances are you're not going to get paid for it unless it's in this section of the contract.
A lot of the answers we cannot give you until we either see the contract or you read it and tell us what's in there, because that's the answer. It has to say who is responsible, not one party or the other. It just says someone. So a good contract should be able to spell out everything that's going to happen, and you should look at that contract and say, how is it handled? Who's responsible for it?
Okay, this next section deals with the payment period. And I know the drivers always know how long it's supposed to take to get paid, but it seems like the motor carrier never really understands this part of the contract.
Yeah, absolutely. The leasing regulations require that the owner-operator be paid within 15 days from submitting the documents that the carrier needs. And
I think that's a key, submitting all the documents.
And not necessarily all the documents. The regulations limit on what the carrier can require. And those documentations are limited to two things. One thing is logbooks, and the other thing is the only thing the carrier needs to get payment from the shipper or broker. That's not a monthly maintenance report. That's not usually toll receipts. That's usually not fuel receipts. But for payment, they can only require logbooks and documents for the carrier to get paid. And usually that's going to be the bill of lading. And
when you're talking about logbooks, you're talking about copies of the logbook.
The original. The carrier keeps the original, and the owner-operator keeps the back copy.
Unfortunately, there are those carriers who will tell you that you get paid when I get paid. We hear that occasionally, and that's not the way.
Can they put that in the contract?
They don't put it in the contract, no, but that's what they'll tell you sometimes. And if that's the situation, that's definitely a red flag that you need to start looking at finding another carrier, because they're either in financial problems or they're withholding your pay, and that's not legal for them to do that. And that does happen, and you hear that from time to time. And he's a good old boy, and he'll pay me when he gets paid, and so forth and so on. Well, that's his responsibility, as the carrier's responsibility, to check out shippers or brokers that they are getting their loads from, to make sure that they are shippers and brokers that pay on a timely basis.
The owner-operator has an agreement with the carrier. The carrier has an agreement with the shipper. The owner-operator has nothing in between him and the shipper.
Okay, you said they have 15 days to pay me after I turn in the paperwork. What if I don't turn in all the paperwork?
Well, the carrier cannot set deadlines for you to submit paperwork. The problem is you're not going to get paid. That 15-day clock never starts. So you want to get that paperwork in there as soon as possible.
Kip, we've been talking about Part F, the payment period, and I know that about half of that part talks about getting paid after you've delivered the load, after you've completed your assignment. But the other half of that part deals with getting paid after termination, after you leave that motor carrier. Let's talk about what that says.
they can withhold your final settlement until you turn in everything that's theirs. The paperwork, the bill of ladings, the other documents, it could be your base plate, those kind of things if it's theirs. So, you need to give them what's theirs so you can cut ties. The carrier can require you to submit other paperwork for, like, for example, your monthly maintenance reports and fuel receipts if they're doing your IFTA and those kind of things. But that can't be a prerequisite for payment. What the carrier has over that is they don't have to dispatch you. They can withhold dispatch until you turn in the certain requirements. Because, as we talked earlier, they assume complete responsibility. So they have to make sure that the vehicle's safe because, that you're actually doing maintenance on the truck because they're actually responsible. You're under their insurance if there's an accident and those kind of things. So they have a role to play. So that's why they're asking this stuff.
And it would also affect their CSA scores.
Absolutely.
It sounds like we're completely out of time in this segment. Let me remind you that this is part one of a two-part series in which I've been talking with Kip Hough and Tom Weakley, both from OOIDA, and we just completed the first half of our discussion on leasing regulations. If you're thinking about leasing onto a motor carrier and you'd like some help deciphering the regulations, give the staff at OOIDA a call. There are no risks and there are no obligations, just friendly people wanting to see you succeed. Also, if you've got any questions about the information in today's program, or if you'd simply like a certificate of completion for this program, just drop us an email. That email address is businesseducation@ooida.com. Someone from our staff will get back with you just as soon as possible. And while you're thinking about it, you might as well join, rejoin, or extend your membership with OOIDA. Remember, OOIDA is the only association that's been fighting for the rights of all professional truck drivers since 1973. To join us in this fight, simply give us a call at 1-800-444-5791.